hosting my talk. And I'm going to start out, as some of the other speakers did, with the theme of this year's Speaker Series, the anniversary of the AIDS, and ask you to think back 80 years and consider how the year 1938 affected the territory of Slovakia. Probably most of you have heard of the Munich Agreement and the association with Czechoslovakia from that angle, which was signed in September of 1938. But one of the lesser known stipulations of the Munich Agreement was that the Czechoslovak government had to immediately come to separate agreements with the governments of Poland and Hungary over disputed territories inhabited by Polish and Hungarian speakers. So the dispute with Hungary affected the Slovak part of the Republic most directly. It led to a separate international agreement from the Munich Agreement called the First Vienna Arbitration. And this arbitration transferred a strip of territory in southern Slovakia to Hungary in November of 1938. So the consequences of this border change is the focus of my own research, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you all about this evening. I will start by explaining a little bit of how I got interested in this work, which is usually the first thing people ask me when they meet me. Then I will describe some of the strategies that the Hungarian state employed to reintegrate this territory and what that meant for everyday people. And then lastly, I'll turn to population movements, which were almost a constant feature of southern Slovakia's society between the years 1938 and 1948. All right. Oh, am I out of order? Yeah, okay. Already out of order. So one of the first questions that I often get when I explain my work is, are you Hungarian or are you Slovak? The answer, funnily enough, is neither. I simply really enjoy Central European history. So my first exposure to Central Europe was when I was an undergraduate and I studied for a semester in Budapest. And the year after I graduated from college, I took a job teaching English in Czechoslovakia, in the very northern part of Slovakia. And as you can see on the map, Czechoslovakia is a border town. It's actually the border of two international boundaries, one with the Czech Republic and one with Poland. And living in Czechoslovakia was fascinating because it's kind of difficult to live in a border town. Pretty much everybody carried three currencies with them at all times: Polish zloty, Slovak crowns, and Czech crowns. Lots of people traveled from one country to another for work. So, for example, there were many men from Czechoslovakia who worked in the steel mill in Třinec on the border, on the other side of the border in Czech Republic. You always had to have your identity papers with you, no matter if you were just going to the store. And there was only one road in and out of town. Every other road was a dead end at the border. So this is what got me interested in the concept of borderlands to begin with, simply living in one. And I really think they're fascinating because they're places where cultures and languages meet and interact with one another. And they're also places where states try to exercise a maximum amount of their power. And furthermore, they're places where certain rights that you and I might take for granted living in the interior don't apply. So from the historical perspective, I discovered that there had been quite a lot of work done on borderlands in the context of both Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The Sudetenland and the German minority that lived in the very west of Czechoslovakia, there's a huge literature on that borderland. In the Hungarian case, there's a massive literature on Transylvania, the borderland between Hungary and Romania. But almost nothing had been done on the southern borderland, and the the Czechoslovak and Hungarian border dispute in southern Slovakia. So that's where I chose to focus my research, and that's where the other two spots on this map come in. The majority of the research for this project was done in the city of Košice, the city of Komárno, and at the Hungarian National Archives in Budapest. So it combines city level, county level, and national level stories to try and figure out what happened in this borderland. But before I jump straight to the year 1938, I'd like to describe a little bit about the larger historical trajectory of southern Slovakia. So it was part of Hungary prior to the First World War. It was part of what the Hungarians referred to as the uplands, what Slovaks referred to as Slovakia, but it was not a distinct territorial unit. It was simply an area where a large population of Hungarians and a large population of Slovaks lived more or less side by side. And the largest city in southern Slovakia, or at least in the part that came back to Hungary in 1938, was the city of Košice. And Košice is was a distinctly multi-ethnic city in both the 19th and 20th centuries. So I have on this slide some statistical data based on censuses that show you the percentage of various nationalities that lived in the city of Košice as the numbers were taken down by census takers at various points in time. And you can see here that on the first official census in 1851, Slovaks make up the clear majority of the city's inhabitants. But under several pressures, industrialization, modernization, and the Hungarian government's assimilationist policies, Slovaks were only counted as 14.81% of the city's inhabitants in 1910. So you have a pretty dramatic drop in a 60-year period in terms of who inhabits this city by nationality. And yet, despite the fact that they only made up 14.1% of the population according to the census, Košice was considered by Slovak nationalists to be a Slovak town. And after World War I, Czechoslovak statesmen argued for Košice's inclusion in the new state, not because it was a majority Slovak town, but because they believed it would be a majority Slovak town, if not for the Hungarian state's Hungarianization policies that in their minds had forced Slovaks to become Hungarians. So Košice, I'm a little off on my slides here. Sorry, I'm going to start from the beginning and see if there we go. All right, so this image is Czechoslovak troops in the city of Košice in 1918. And so the city did, along with the rest of southern Slovakia, become the southern borderland of the new Czechoslovak state in 1918. And we're going to see this, a very similar image to this in a few moments when we finally get to the year 1938. All right, so in the interwar period, Košice was part of the Czechoslovak Republic, and under Czechoslovak rule, we again have a very dramatic change in the ethnic composition of the city of Košice, so that by the time, under the 1921 census done by Czechoslovakia, Slovaks made up the clear majority of the city's inhabitants, 60%. And I should note that Košice is a special case, and most of the rest of southern Slovakia continued to have a Hungarian majority, even according to Czechoslovak censuses. But it gives you a sense of what some of the issues were and some of the nationality problems that the two governments fought over. And it also hopefully sets the stage somewhat for 1938. So you have this territory of southern Slovakia. It already has a history of changes in sovereignty, and the area has already been disputed by two states, or claimed by two states. The Hungarian government's position throughout the interwar period was for what we call integral revisionism, which means that they wanted the entire territory that Hungary lost after the First World War back in their state. And the sort of catchphrase they used was everything back. And Hungarian statesmen decided to focus on southern Slovakia as the first target for expansion based on demographics. So since the majority of this territory was Hungarian-speaking, they argued it should belong to the Kingdom of Hungary. And this was very similar, in fact, basically verbatim, the argument that Adolf Hitler made for the inclusion of the Sudetenland into Germany. So the new border was drawn in November of 1938. So the Czechoslovak foreign minister is pictured here along with the Italian foreign minister Ciano, the German foreign minister Ribbentrop, and Hungarian foreign minister Kanya. And there was a stipulation in the Munich Agreement to solve this territorial dispute between Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but the two governments could not come to any agreement as to where this new border should be. And therefore, technically, it was supposed to be decided by the same four powers that decided the Munich Agreement. So France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. But after the extremely negative press of the Munich Agreement, Britain and France no longer wanted to be involved, and Germany and Italy happily became the arbiters of Central Europe. And the area of the First Vienna Arbitration is depicted here in this bright green color. So you can see it's like a very narrow strip of territory that goes along the southern border. This was 12,000 square kilometers of territory. It had a little over 1 million people living in that territory. According to the extraordinary census that the Hungarian government did in December of 1938, the territory was 84.7% Hungarian, 11.6% Slovak, and 3.7% other, which was mostly Ruthenian and German. You might also notice that in this territory, which was given to Hungary, are nearly all of the urban areas in southern Slovakia. The only exceptions are in the west, with Bratislava and Nitra. Otherwise, basically all of the cities became part of Hungary. So that's more or less why and how southern Slovakia became part of Hungary in 1938. But I think actually more interesting perhaps is what that meant for people who lived there. This is a little tricky. So this photograph is the Hungarian troops entering Košice in November 1938, November 11, 1938. And it looks awfully similar to the image that we looked at a few minutes ago. So the arbitration was signed on November 2nd, and the Hungarian army reoccupied this territory between November 5th and 11th. And they had several objectives that they wanted to fulfill during this reoccupation and in the first few months of the change in sovereignty. The first was to establish physical control of the area. And this is Hungarian soldiers posing with a bunker that was built by the Czechoslovak military. These bunkers were built all along the border to try and defend the state from Hungary. but now they were basically in the middle of Hungarian territory and no longer served any sort of defensive purpose. This is simply, I would say, Hungarian soldiers sort of bragging about the fact that they are the occupants of this territory. But other than this physical reoccupation, the Hungarian government also sought to delegitimize the old system and emphasize the new world order of sort of up-and-coming fascist states and the Hungarianness of the region. So on the image on the left, you see townspeople tearing down the boundary with the Czechoslovak symbol on it, so the border marker. You also heard in speeches dramatic accounts of how Hungarians had been persecuted during the Czechoslovak period, things like not being allowed to sing Hungarian songs, not being allowed to wear Hungarian national costumes, and in both the Hungarian press and in official speeches, there's a very heavy emphasis on persecution. It's quite trumped up. Of course, life was sort of difficult in southern Slovakia, but definitely the Hungarian government sought to emphasize that wherever possible. And then the other image here is the locomotive which carried the Hungarian government to Košice on November 10th, 1938. And on the left, you have the image of Benito Mussolini. In the center, Hungary's regent, Miklos Horthy, and Adolf Hitler on the right. And there's no clearer message here that Hungary has powerful friends that made this possible. This is unfortunate. So this photo is, as you can see at the bottom here, this is Hungarian soldiers posing with Slovak street signs. Immediately upon entering an urban area, they would tear down all of the street signs and replace them with handwritten ones in Hungarian. And I use this image to demonstrate that the politics of language was a big part of their emphasis on Hungarianness. Hungarian was to be the language of public discourse in southern Slovakia. One of the first things that the government did was quickly open up lots of Hungarian-speaking schools, schools which instructed in Hungarian language, and the number of students learning in Slovak and learning Slovak as a foreign language dipped dramatically, almost overnight. And Košice's dramatic demographic swings also continued under Hungarian rule. According to the 1941 census, Hungarians now made up 83% of Košice's inhabitants, whereas the percentage of Slovaks plummeted to 11%. So again, we have these massive swings of the pendulum. But I want to emphasize that despite these outward signs that one day everyone spoke Slovak and the next Hungarian, the reality, especially for urban areas, was that many people in the region remained multilingual in their daily communications. They spoke both Hungarian and Slovak, sometimes German as well. In fact, in my research, I've seen over and over a strong resistance by the inhabitants of southern Slovakia to monolingualism. Whether they identified as Slovak or as Hungarian, people argued that knowing both languages was part of their regional identity, and they didn't want the Hungarian state or any state to interfere with that. All right, this image is of Hungarian soldiers passing out bread during the reoccupation ceremonies. And this was a big part of delegitimizing Czechoslovak rule. There was a catchphrase that was used very often during these reoccupations, the notion of Hungarian bread for Hungarians. And it promoted the fiction that the Czechoslovak state did not or could not provide for people's daily needs in southern Slovakia. In fact, the region took a nosedive economically when it became part of Hungary. And this is partially because the Czechoslovak economy was larger and more industrialized than Hungary's, But it's also because of the nature of border changes and messing around with borders. It disrupts the patterns of distribution and consumption. You automatically have transportation issues as roads don't really make sense anymore. It takes a lot of time for local economies to reorient themselves. So for the average citizen, they would have experienced an economic downturn, a more difficult life after becoming part of Hungary. All right. So this image is of posters of Miklos Horthy that were passed out to residents during these reoccupation ceremonies. And I would say that he is the person who benefited the most from Hungary's takeover of southern Slovakia. So the regent was portrayed in the propaganda around the reoccupation as the man responsible for Hungary's successful enlargement. The poster at the bottom says, our leader, vezér, our leader, and it's mimicking the same discourse that you saw in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. It's part of trying to legitimize Hungarian rule, but it's beyond that. It's also trying to legitimize the conservative status quo that was the Hungarian government at that moment in time. All right, as you can see on this next slide here, another very interesting consequence of the First Vienna Arbitration was actually a rise in irredentism. And when I say irredentism, I'm simply talking about the claims that one state makes on another state. And I already mentioned that the Hungarian government had this position of everything back, and that's what it says here on the castle ruins above Filiapovo, along with an image of historic Hungary in the middle. And a successful reannexation of southern Slovakia did not satisfy Hungary's desire to enlarge its territory. If anything, it heightened it. It spurred them on further. They wanted to annex the rest of Slovakia. They also wanted to annex Transylvania and parts of Yugoslavia as well. But it also made Slovak nationalists into irredentists as well. They wanted southern Slovakia back. And it's really unfortunate that the image is breaking on in this way, but if you can see at the very bottom here, this image, it's a little bit of a nebulous line. They don't perfectly define what they want back. And in fact, they are including this city here, Václav in Hungarian, which was never part of Czechoslovakia. So they're actually making a larger territorial claim than anything that was ever part of the Czechoslovak state, wanting territories even further south than the interwar border. And there were some truly utopian plans on the part of Slovak nationalists during this period to transform their state into a territorially larger and racially and ethnically homogenous state. And it actually revolved around repatriating Slovaks abroad. So I guess you can see down here this number of 750,000 Slovaks living in Hungary, but also they had pretty grand plans to repatriate Slovak Americans and bring them home. In fact, it's likely that some of your ancestors were exactly who they had in mind. They wanted to use these Slovaks living abroad to colonize areas where Jews and Hungarians were to be removed and make Slovakia a homogeneous state. And although it didn't happen, it is quite significant for what occurs after World War II in southern Slovakia. Right, so these are some of the most immediate ways that things changed in southern Slovakia after the Hungarian annexation. And now I want to move on to looking at population movements. And I'm going to have to just restart over so that I can get back on proper footing here. My apologies. It's not going to work. All right, well, I said before that population movements was a pretty much constant feature of Southern Slovak life between 1938 and 1948, and I would like to look at some of the ways in which that occurred. So this decade-long, nearly continuous movement of populations in and out of Southern Slovakia started immediately after the annexation by Hungary, when somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people, mostly bureaucrats who worked for the Czechoslovak government, but also the so-called colonists, people who had been given land in the Czechoslovak land reform in the early 1920s. These people were either expelled from Southern Slovakia or decided to leave because of the unfavorable political circumstances. It's very hard to determine who's an expellee and who decides on their own to leave, but it sort of doesn't matter. A very large number of refugees leave Southern Slovakia and they go into either Slovakia or into the Czech lands. And the Czech lands were already brimming with refugees due to Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland. So it is a real crisis in terms of how many people are moving from one side of the border to the other in 1938. And at the same time that this movement of Czechs and Slovaks out of Southern Slovakia is occurring, the Slovak autonomous government decides to expel several thousand Jews, hoping to make them Hungary's problem. And this had to do with the fact that Slovak nationalists tried to blame Jews for these territorial losses. They argued, without any evidence really, that the Jews had sided with the Hungarians. But when these people were expelled, Hungary refused to let them enter. And they ended up in makeshift camps along the border where they stayed for months. November, December, January, February, very cold, very wet months. They were provided for by the Bratislava Jewish community. Eventually, some of them were given transit visas and made it to Palestine. Others were finally allowed back into Slovakia. And this was the first, actually, of a large and multi-directional Jewish refugee movement between Slovakia and Hungary. And this is a massive history. It could be the subject of its own talk. It's extremely interesting. It took many, many forms between 1938 and 1944. But I would like to just highlight one element of these refugee movements. All right, so the Jewish refugee movements I have on this table highlighted in yellow. So you see, in 1939, when Germany occupied the rest of the Czech lands, Jews from the Czech lands fled to Hungary. Jews from Slovakia also fled to Hungary in March of 1939, once the Republic was finally broken up, because they feared aggressively anti-Jewish policies by the Slovak government. The next one on here is 1942. Which is the year that Slovakia deported its Jewish population. In that year, there was a massive movement of Jews into Hungary, Slovak Jews into Hungary. And then in 1944, which you can't even see, in 1944, Hungary deported its Jewish population, and there was a large movement of Jews back over across the border into Slovakia. But I wanted to highlight the role of Zionist youth groups who organized rescues for Slovak and Hungarian Jews. And in this photograph, we have some members of Hashomer Hatzair, which was one of these Zionist youth groups, and they're meeting in the forest. They weren't allowed to assemble in cities. And they organized clandestine border crossings between Slovakia and Hungary in 1942. And I found evidence of smuggling operations in Nové Zámky, Golanta, and Levice. Certainly there were some in the Košice region as well. Historians think that somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 Slovak Jews successfully crossed into Hungary in 1942, many with the help of Hashomer Hatzair and other Zionist youth groups. And that's a pretty significant percentage of the Jewish population of Slovakia. Then in 1944, when Hungary deported its Jewish population, these Zionist youth groups again created smuggling operations to send people back into Slovakia. And we have absolutely no idea how many people were successful in doing this. But most historians think it was at least 1,000 people that made it into Slovakia in 1944. So the last of the population movements that I would like to discuss this evening is those that occurred after territory was returned to Czechoslovakia in 1945. So this time period between 1945 and 1948 is an extremely tumultuous era. There are a lot of political changes in both Hungary and Czechoslovakia in a very short period of time. But again, I would say that the most impactful part of yet another border change for southern Slovakia was a mass movement of people. And this time it took the form of retributive politics, and politicians pushed for even more dramatic measures to achieve ethnic homogenization. So first, and you can see up here, 1945, this movement between Hungary and Slovakia and Hungary. In 1945, anybody who had migrated to southern Slovakia during the period of Hungarian rule was, by law, immediately expelled to Hungary. And there were several thousand people that this applied to. And there were also Hungarian speakers that chose to flee to Hungary at this moment as well. The Hungarian government actually closed its border in early 1946 to try and prevent more Hungarians from coming in. They had a refugee crisis of their own on their hands. Then you can see this 1946 movement from Slovakia to the Czech lands. This was a forced population exchange the Czechoslovak government did when they realized that they weren't going to be able to expel the Hungarian population in total. They decided that one strategy they could take would be to at least move them away from the borderlands, move them away from areas that are contiguous with Hungary. And so between 10 and 20,000 Hungarian speakers were moved from their homes in southern Slovakia into Bohemia, into areas that were recently vacated by Germans who had been expelled to Germany. But the largest piece of this movement, of this population movement puzzle, occurred between 1947 and 1948, when there was a population exchange that was conducted between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So this desire to wholesale expel Hungarians from Czechoslovakia had to be abandoned because of lack of Allied support. The Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain sort of changed their minds and said, you can't just expel a million people, a million Hungarians into Hungary. So the idea was to have a one-for-one population exchange between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Slovaks who lived in Hungary, mostly in the southeastern part of the country, nowhere near the border with Czechoslovakia, those people could volunteer for repatriation to Czechoslovakia. It's an interesting term because none of them had ever lived in Czechoslovakia before, but they called it repatriation. So they could volunteer, and an equal number of Hungarians would be selected by the Czechoslovak government to be sent to Hungary. So the Czechoslovak government sent teams of recruiters to Slovak-speaking areas and promised those who volunteered that they would get land, that they would have good jobs, and they would have good lives among their Slovak brothers. And I think that also the fact that Hungary was a loser and Czechoslovakia purportedly a winner in World War II was also a favorite line of argumentation for these recruiters. The Hungarian government, meanwhile, wanted the Slovaks to stay in order to prevent Hungarians from coming in. So in the end, it ends up being around 73,000 Slovaks who are moved from Hungary into Czechoslovakia. And as I said, these people had not lived in Czechoslovakia before. Most of them were the descendants of settlers who had migrated from northern parts of the Kingdom of Hungary to the plains in the 18th century. And they were concentrated in 3 areas of Hungary, in this Danube Bend region, which is, I don't know, 50, 60 kilometers south of the border, in the northeast and in the southeast around the city of Békéscsaba. So this image is of Slovaks who moved from Hungary to Czechoslovakia. And you can see how they traveled. They traveled in train cars. And the 73,000 Slovaks who moved to Hungary, pretty much all moved to Czechoslovakia, pretty much all were settled in, on the immediate border between Hungary and Czechoslovakia in order to try and create a bulwark of Slovak speakers to prevent Hungary from ever making the argument again that they could just move the border north. And the estimates of how many Hungarians were involved in the exchange is around 90,000. And this is an image of Hungarians who were moved as part of the population exchange. So this obviously fell short of some of these grandiose plans that had been imagined during the war, but it was nevertheless a pretty significant demographic change for the region. And this image is really cool. Unfortunately, it's stuck, but it's of some cows. And I use it to demonstrate the fact that it wasn't just people who moved in 1947, 48. They were also allowed to bring all of their movable property with them. So, for example, the statistics we have for the first 3 weeks of the population exchange are that relocated Slovaks had brought 3 threshing machines, 43 seed drills, and 321 horses with them to Czechoslovakia. And the Hungarians had brought 77 threshing machines, 346 seed drills, and they had 845 horses to Hungary. So it is really uplifting your life. Most of these people were peasants, and they needed to learn how to cultivate a totally different kind of land, and really reorient their lives to their new situations. Now, the Hungarian government attempted to settle these people together, but it didn't always work out that way. And I wanted to show you 2 digital maps that I've created about the border changes. This one is showing where in Czechoslovakia the Hungarians were coming from and where in Hungary they were moving to. And I will just explain that all of them came from the immediate border region, and they were moved all over the country. And then this one, I think, demonstrates a little bit better, sort of. Well, you can see it. This heat map, though, shows that there's a huge concentration of Hungarians from southern Slovakia that are moved into southern Hungary. And this is, I just want to point this out because this is a territory where there was not a large Slovak population. And what the Hungarian government discovered was that most of the people who volunteered for resettlement were relatively poor peasants that owned very little land. And many of the Hungarians who were chosen were rather wealthy peasants. They were chosen on the basis of the fact that they owned land. And so the Hungarian government realized quite early on that there was no way they could compensate these people with Slovak land, and so they decided to give them land that had been confiscated from the Swabian Germans, the German population that lived in Hungary, which was also expelled after the Second World War. So in fact, it was never a one-for-one exchange, and it was never a situation in which a Hungarian village was swapped with a Slovak village. It ended up really, it became a chain reaction. Once you move one group, you have to move another, and the entire region of Central Europe's ethnic makeup was changed by this series of events. And the last photo I have, which of course works, is the current border of Hungary and Slovakia, the Danube River at Komárno. And what I've talked about in this presentation is really just a few of the aspects that I think made southern Slovakia in the middle of the 20th century such a fascinating case study of a borderland in an area where there's a territorial dispute. But there's plenty more aspects I could talk about, so I will end there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take some questions.
So how different are the languages and the cultures also of the Slovak-Hungarian?
So she asked how different are Hungarian and Slovak languages. And they are very different. They are not even part of the same linguistic family. So whereas Czechs and Slovaks can mutually understand one another a lot of the time, there are almost no cognates between Hungarian and Slovak, or very few, and it's really, they're completely different, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Kind of delving in the history, but what is important that I'm from Košice. And I was 10 years old, and I was watching when the first terrorist Hungarian groups were marching in before the Košický Dome, you know, with my mom holding her hand. And we were just amazed, you know, what a terrible group was suddenly coming. And then came the so-called motorized kind of Hungarian army, and they all came on bicycles, you know. So that was the Hungarian motorized group. I think you pointed up very many salient moments of that area of the time. As far as the nationalities, there is a very poignant anecdote when in 1919 there was they were already when Czechoslovakia was established, then in Slovakia they were trying to establish that who is nationality, you know. And these were mostly Czech officials who came from Prague, and they had great difficulties to assess who is Slovak and who is Magyar and who is that and who is that. So they tried to figure out how to find out, you know, how do you pray, how do you speak, how do you sing. And then in these rural areas, you know, many were just saying, to všetko jedno, it doesn't really matter. If the butter is on one side, we are Slovak. If the butter is on the other side of the bread, we are Hungarian. You know, so kind of that. I think what is very important, what you said, that Košice during the Czechoslovakia was a really rich town, you know, and Hungary was a very poor country, you know, after the Trianon agreement. And so when they came in, the Hungarians, you know, and then they bought up everything, whatever is possible, and you know, in couple of months, the stores were empty. So the folks started to rebel, and they were crying out, in Hungarian, that minden drága, vissza Praga. That everything is expensive, we want back Prague, So it was quite interesting, and so I started my 5th elementary school in Hungarian. And so there was a guy, and he saw that I'm Slovak, So he was bugging me and then started to address me that I'm a Slovak pig, and so I tolerated for a while, and then a fist fight, And I told him, when I'm Slovak pig, you are Magyar pig, Hungarian pig. So I was almost thrown out from the school. So it was a very difficult time. So well, there are many interesting parts what you pointed out, and also the Jewish problem, because mostly they were speaking Hungarian or German, so that way the allegiance was on that side, more or less, So. Okay, congratulations. I'm looking forward to your book.
Thank you very much.
So, thanks, this was a very nice lecture. My question to you is, in the 1980s and 90s, this seems, while there wasn't any forced movement, the Hungarians and the Slovaks were again fighting for land. And so I was, and the population, so I know it's not part of your lecture, but it would be interesting. Did you look at it and did you see how it linked to the forced movement in the 40s?
Well, I think the most interesting way I can answer that question is to talk a little bit about the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's strategy to join the European Union. And when Hungary was getting ready to join, one of the main arguments that Orban made was that it was a way that the Hungarians could be reunited again, even if they couldn't have their land. They could at least have the Schengen borders where they could move freely. So he made an irredentist argument, in fact, as a pro-EU, point. And so it's definitely there. It's part of the nationalist discourse. But Slovakia is doing much better economically than Hungary at the moment, and the Hungarians that I know who live in Slovakia prefer to live in Slovakia, and they don't really want to have an association with the current Hungarian government.
Do you have any information on any families that were mixed marriages between Slovaks and Hungarians, and how they resolved what their nationalities were? Can you comment on that?
That's a great question. It was extremely common, and I don't think anybody really thought about it until somebody asked. So it often came down to which school they sent their child to. This is one of the things when the Hungarian government came in and they were trying to establish who was a potentially loyal citizen. One of the measures that they took was, did you send your child to a Slovak school or did you send your child to a Hungarian school? And if you sent your child to a Hungarian school, that was considered evidence of a true Magyar patriot. And if you did not, it was evidence that you perhaps were a fan of the Czechoslovak government, perhaps too easily assimilable, if you will. Thank you. Yes.
I just had a question going back to the 38-39 period. What I remember reading was that when Slovakia had to declare independence in 39, that basically Hitler said to Tiso, he said, well, either declare independence now or Hungary will take you. So which imply that Hungary would have taken the whole thing, I would suppose. But in fact, what happened, as you pointed out, is that the border was set, where this new border was. So did you, in your research, did you get any more perspective on exactly the dynamic there? Was Hitler and the Germans trying to, broker compromise between the Hungarians, like, give the Hungarians something while the Slovaks get some independence? Was that the tenor of the thing?
I would say it was more a case of Hitler and the German government trying to leverage these irredentist claims against each state and sort of hold it over them for various favors. So for closer economic contact, for complying with Jewish policy. And he said things all the time that gave one side or the other the impression that they were going to get more territory. And the border really was pretty tenuous. In fact, when Slovakia declared independence, Hungary did take a very small chunk of territory, very tiny, just like a couple of kilometers of land, but they tried to have this immediate land grab. But the other thing I will say about that is that the Hungarian mentality was that it was all the Czechs' fault. And if the Slovaks actually had freedom to choose, they would choose to be part of Hungary. They were totally delusional, but they really believed it. So in their mind, people like Pál Teleki, the Hungarian prime minister between 1939 and 1941, he really believed that he could negotiate some sort of agreement with the Slovaks to bring them back into Hungary.
I just would like to answer to the Ken Bomber. In the book of Mary Hyman, Czechoslovakia, the state that failed, there is a direct quotation by this Anglo-American author that Slovakia independence was declared on March 14th. Yeah? But Tiso was ordered to Berlin all together with the Czech President Hácha on the 12th. And before Tiso arrived, then Hitler sent a telegram to the Hungarian embassy to Stolyai Döme, who was there the ambassador, later the prime minister, oriented towards that, announcing him that he, Hitler, before Tiso came, is going to declare an independent Slovakia. And then next day came Tiso and Hitler told him, you have to blitzschnell, quickly claim independence. This was in morning, and in evening came President Hácha from Prague, and when he heard this, and he fainted. They needed a doctor around. And so in this particular book, this is very precisely described how did it happen with this independence. And I think that's a legitimate concern that actually Slovakia would have been swallowed by Poland and Hungary, So I think that's how it is, okay?
And it was the strategy, Hitler's strategy, to always do these sort of technicalities like that. Well, I didn't break the Munich Agreement because technically Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore because the Slovaks declared independence. He did the same thing with Yugoslavia in 1941. He always set these very precise terms, which really was just a way to sort of cover himself, but it was clear what he was doing.
Good evening, my name is Patrick Rayleigh. I'm at the UN Association here in Washington, D.C. fascinating talk. I wanted to ask if you had done any research to poll what young Slovaks and Hungarians think about your research or your book and so forth. There any thoughts about the history and the realities and what their perception is? Is it important to them today in any direction moving forward?
Thank you. The younger generation of historians in Slovakia and Hungary are really committed to working with one another. There's a lot of cross-cultural research projects that are funded by the European Union that are really exciting. And so I think that my research falls into that sort of vein. I think that they enjoy it because it's trying to represent both Hungarian history and Slovak history to a certain degree. But I would say that I'm just one among many, and that this is a trend, and the research is going transnational in Central Europe. Everybody's trying to do a project that's not in a little national box, but thinking about the region more broadly.
In your research, did you come across any activity or involvement with the Roma or the Gypsies in Hungary and Slovakia?
So there's sometimes mentions of them in 1938 in this period of re-annexation, and I've seen some images, but I haven't really seen a thorough discussion of it. As far as I can tell, they assumed they all spoke Hungarian, but I don't think they were concerned with them particularly.
I'm just wondering, since Slovakia's formation in 1918, from 1918 to 1938, it sounds like the Hungarians in the back of their mind had the empire to kind of draw from their history over a long time period, and the Slovaks at a much shorter time period to kind of have a national identity. Did that have any type of balance or impact on it, or bigger powers were kind of at play, and the small Slovak population was kind of an afterthought, although they're trying to appease Hungary for other reasons, that Slovak mentality or awareness was just very low about the issue, didn't really kind of factor into the decisions at all?
I think that the Hungarian mentality when it came to these territories was so emotional and so illogical in terms of what they thought their former subjects wanted. They honestly believed that these people had been tricked by foreigners, and that given the choice, if there was a plebiscite, for example, they would all really want to be part of Hungary again. So I just don't even know that there's, from the Hungarian perspective, a way to even analyze it other than from this very illogical imperialist perspective. But clearly, Germany was in control of the situation practically the entire time. And these two states tried to jockey for position. They did things to try and gain the upper hand. They both joined the invasion of the Soviet Union, for example, thinking that that might help their favor with Germany. But they didn't necessarily have the power to make these things happen by themselves.
I found it very interesting when you described Hungary's concern about bringing back a lot of Hungarians who were poor and who would have to be resettled, and that they were worried about that actually, and weren't anxious to bring back more of them. And here they've gone from demanding everything, saying everything back, and then suddenly they weren't making a maximum effort to bring back their own citizens. I found that a rather strange change.
I can say a couple of things about that. First of all, they're very often more concerned with territory than people, as much as they make a sort of rhetorical argument about caring for their Hungarian brethren. When push comes to shove, usually the concern is territorial. But also Hungary was in such a terrible economic state after the Second World War. And their population was huge compared to the amount of land that they had. And I think there were serious concerns about feeding everyone at a basic level. So, you know, some of it was, I would say, sort of hoping that there might be a chance in the future for another territorial change if the Hungarians stay put in southern Slovakia. But also it was a total crisis situation, and they didn't have anywhere to really put these people. All right, so I can take one more question if there is one, or otherwise, I can just thank you again for your attention, and